When you're starting out with one-handed solving, it might be a little bit frustrating that you can't turn very quickly at all using one hand. So in this video, I've got some beginner tips for helping you get faster at turning the cube with one hand. When you're doing one-handed solving for the first time, it will feel very uncomfortable. So here are some tips and ideas to help you out with improving your turning speed for one-handed solving. So the first tip that I can give you is to make sure that you're using a cube that you're comfortable with, because hardware is a little bit more important, in my opinion, in one-handed solving rather than two-handed solving. So if you have quite small hands, it may be actually useful to invest in a smaller cube, maybe not this small, but somewhere in the range of 50 millimeters to 55 millimeters, and just try that out and see how you go, because particularly if you have small hands, you might find it hard to reach for this R prime move or reach for this U move if your fingers are a little bit shorter than others. So yeah, try and look at maybe getting yourself and experimenting with a smaller cube for one-handed solving. And the other thing that's really important is to make sure your cube isn't very tight. So sometimes for two-handed solving, your cubes, it's perfectly fine to have your cube quite tight and quite stiff, but for one-handed solving, you want to use a little bit less effort to actually turn the sides. So you may want your cube to be a little bit looser. Personally, I keep the same tensions for two-handed and one-handed solving, but when you're starting out in particular, it can be very tiring on your muscles to actually use a lot of force to continuously turn the cube with one hand. So for that reason, I suggest perhaps experimenting with making your cube a little bit looser to make it easier to turn with less force. In addition to doing lots and lots of solves, you can also do things like train specific triggers or sequences of moves. So for example, the most common move is the sexy move, RU, R prime, U prime. This is, very frequently used in all sorts of algorithms and even F2L. So that goes R, U, R prime, U prime. And so here are the finger tricks that I use for this trigger. So I'll do the R move with my standard pinky move, U with the flick like that, R prime with bringing my pinky back down, and then U prime with my index there. So R, U, R prime, U prime, R, U, R prime, U prime. And this is something you can just repeat and practice over and over again. So R, U, R prime, U prime. And then eventually you'll be really comfortable and get fast with it. But yeah, again, like I say, this will take quite some time. Some other examples of triggers that you can practice are things like R prime, U prime, R, U. So R prime like that, U prime, R, and then U. Or things like R, U, R prime, F prime. It's important to, get comfortable with switching between R, U and F moves as well. So R, U, R prime, F prime is how I do it, but you can, experiment with your own sorts of finger tricks for that sort of thing. I do want to reiterate that at first, these sorts of triggers will feel really uncomfortable and you may find yourself dropping the cube a lot, even for a few weeks or a few months. But over time, your hand strength will improve and your fingers will adapt to using these new techniques. And with the grip and the finger tricks that I've shown you in the previous few videos, you should be well on your way to getting to, a point where you're quite comfortable with using one hand to turn the cube. To improve your finger tricks and your turning speed, you don't have to sit down with a timer and do timed solves over and over again. You really can just, walk around your house or wherever you live or, on the train and just sit down with one hand and just do heaps of random moves on the cube and get comfortable with, keeping a solid grip on the cube, not letting it go, using all sorts of fingers and finger tricks around the cube and just getting, more and more comfortable and familiar with that. So that's another thing you can do. You'll also find that when you start out, you may run into a lot of problems doing algorithms for your last layer using only one hand. So this is because when you're using two hands to solve the cube, a lot of these algorithms will be subconscious and stored in your muscle memory. So you don't really know the move by move. You're kind of relying on your fingers and your muscle memory to do the algorithm. And when you're turning a lot more slowly and doing it one move at a time, you may just forget or make a mistake during the algorithm. So algorithms are things that you'll need to go away and practice just doing them with one hand. So you'll just need to drill it over and over again. So here's an example of a U permutation. So R, U prime, R, U, R, U, R, U prime, R prime, U prime, R2, like that. And particularly for longer and more complicated algorithms, you might find that you have this problem where you forget the algorithm midway through. You might also see lots of videos where people use the table to either realign a misaligned cube or to help them out with the rotation. My personal opinion is that you should try and avoid using the table where possible, but it can certainly be advantageous to use it sometimes. But yeah, try and use it sparingly. So here, for example, we've got this misaligned layer, and well, it just might be handy to just tap it on the table, and that should realign your layer, and you should go ahead and solve. Because when you have misalignments and lockups in one-handed solving, that's yeah, it's not really very good. So in those sort of situations, it can be handy to use the table, but the ultimate goal should be to not get those sorts of lockups, and you should be more accurate with your turning and try and avoid those lockups. For rotations, it's probably fine again to use the table. Particularly if it's a really nasty rotation, or again, if you slip up your hands during the solve. So that's fine as well, but I think the ultimate thing is just try and use them sparingly. Also, when you start out solving one-handed, you might find that the movements of your hand and fingers and wrist are a little bit unfamiliar, and so your hand, whichever hand you're using, will get quite tired with practice. And so basically, I just recommend, if your hand's getting too tired, just stop practicing. And as the more you practice and get comfortable with the finger tricks, the longer you'll find that you'll be able to solve and practice for longer periods at a time. But when you're starting out, if your hands are getting sore, then stop it and come back to do some one-handed solving later. So as annoying as it may sound, I think a really large part of getting good at one-handed turning and then one-handed solving is just spending a lot of time doing it and practicing it. Over time, you'll improve your hand strength, your muscle memory, and your hand and fingers will adapt to the new style of solving. And there are certainly some pointers and tips along the way that I've discussed and talked about in this video, which I hope are helpful. But yeah, the main thing is putting in a lot of time and effort.